This is the title that I've given myself, Ecological Overshoot. It's about economic growth, energy, and the population conundrum. Let me get into a full bore here. And I'll start by really summarizing everything that I'm going to be talking about. This, if you can't stay for the whole show, will be what we cover. I'm going to make the case, first of all, that we're not intellectually equipped to deal with the global eco-crisis. It's true that climate change is a major concern, but it's merely one symptom of a much larger problem, ecological overshoot. And overshoot is in turn a symptom of profound chronic civilizational dysfunction. I'm going to make the point too that humans are storytellers. We socially construct narratives or stories about just about everything. And then we act out of these made up constructs as if they were real. I'm going to emphasize that our current economic construct bears almost no relationship to the biophysical realities that it purports to represent. Similarly, despite popular hype about achieving 100% renewable green energy by 2050, a story, the modern world remains dependent on fossil fuel, and the renewable energy transition has barely started. And if it were successful, it would exacerbate, not fix, overshoot. Overshoot means that humans are destroying the biophysical basis of our own existence. So absent a new story which is compatible with reality, I'm going to argue that there will be a major economic contraction and a population contraction by the end of this century. So that covers the ground. I'll now get into the details. First of all, we have to understand that human beings are an evolved species, but that our central nervous systems evolved during a period of relative simplicity. We tend, therefore, to think in simple, linear, immediate cause-effect terms. We tend to fixate on one problem at a time, climate change, the pandemic, and then back to climate change. Ordinary people just don't get complexity. We don't think systematically, and therefore we fail to connect the dots. For example, climate change and the pandemic are both symptoms of overshoot. Even when we do understand something, we don't tend to act rationally. It's a myth that humans are a rational species. Almost everything going on of importance in the world is not based on reason, but rather on emotional responses to events in our lives. Just consider the current Mideast war, for example. The bottom line of all of this is that human beings, as really Paleolithic organisms, are not well adapted to the hyper-complex world of our own making. And as a biologist, I think it's fair to say that natural selection still operates. And if we're not well adapted to the environment that we've created, we may well be selected out by that changing environment. So the bottom line is that the human brain is cognitively obsolete to deal with the crises that we're finding ourselves in. So what do I mean by overshoot? The real ecological threat here is that the human species is using biologically produced resources faster than ecosystems can regenerate, and producing wastes in excess of the ecosphere's assimilative capacities. So we're overfishing, we're destroying soils. About a third of the agricultural land on Earth has already been removed from production because of overuse. We're depleting forests, we're drawing down water tables. Just about every trend that we examine from a biophysical perspective shows overuse occurring. So we're literally depleting and dissipating the biophysical basis of our own existence. And that's the archetypical definition of biophysical unsustainability. And I have to point out that this is a systemic or civilizational crisis. It's not sectoral. It's not an economic problem. It's not a climate problem. It's not a biodiversity problem. It has to do with the structure of our whole civilization and how we interact with the biophysical world. This means that virtually all so-called environmental problems, climate change, plunging biodiversity, land soil degradation, and so on, are co-symptoms of overshoot. So for most of human evolutionary history, the human population has been held in check by negative feedback. So overshoot's a really recent phenomenon. Negative feedback simply means those things that tend to counteract growth in population. Humans are, like all other species, capable of exponential population growth. But for 99.9, literally 99.9% of our history as an identifiable species, we've not exhibited exponential growth because disease, food shortages, territorial conflicts, and so on kept us in check. That's negative feedback. So it took nearly 250,000 years for our population to reach 1 billion in the early 1800s, just about 200 years ago. Then with the scientific and industrial revolutions, positive feedback took over. So what science did was enable us to control disease, food shortages, and so on. And for the first time in our entire history, we were able to exhibit our full potential for exponential growth. So in just the past 200 years, that's 1,250th as much time as it took to reach 1 billion people, we added an additional 7 billion people or so. Meanwhile, gross world product increased 100-fold, and per capita incomes, which is to say consumption, increased by an average of 13 globally and 25-fold in rich countries. The problem is, of course, that the Earth did not get any larger while this was going on. What are the causal factors here? Well, first of all, as I say, from a biological perspective, overshoot is a product of human nature. Human beings, like all other species of which we have any real knowledge, will expand to fill all accessible habitats, and you cannot name another species which has a larger geographical range on the planet than humans. No macro species at any rate. And we have a tendency to use all available resources. And in the case of humans, our unique quality is that the term availability is constantly being redefined by technology. So if you just think of oil and natural gas, for example, we've been running out for decades, but as soon as we hit one blockage, a new technology is developed to enable us to access other reserves of petroleum, for example, that were previously uneconomic to get at. So fracking is the current rage, and the tight oil of the United States in the last couple of decades has been the major source of new energy on the planet, simply because a new technology became available, enabling us to continue to scrape the bottom of our earthly barrel. So the main point is we have two natural predispositions: expansion into all habitats and a capacity and a tendency to use up all available resources. So it's a product of human nature. On the other hand, there's also culture involved here. Overshoot is a product of culture, is to say nurture. So nature and nurture work together here. And the problem here is that human beings socially construct their lived realities. We are a unique species as storytellers. It's accurate to say that human groups create conceptual frames or interpretations of reality. We don't live in the real world. We construct conceptual frames. You can think of political ideologies, economic paradigms, scientific models, cultural narratives, religious doctrines. All of these things are products of the human mind that have no parallel in the natural world. Every culture's framing is different and represents a particular take on reality, which the citizens of that culture unconsciously assume to be the one and true reality. And the problem is that the frames, the constructed frames through which we view external reality, determine the kind of reality that we perceive. So there's a huge problem here. If human beings live out of their constructed realities as if they were real, what happens if their realities are not a good map for the external world? And I'm going to make the case that modern techno-industrial society is living out of an overly simplistic, reductionist social construct called neoliberal economics. And again, that takes us back to my opening gambit here, that we have an exceedingly limited way of conceiving reality because of our Paleolithic brains, and our economic models is simply one example of that. I don't mean to pick on economists, but it happens to be a very core problem here. So neoliberal economics is a product of the human mind, which is virtually untethered from biophysical reality. So here we are living out of, globally, a model of the nature of human interaction with the biophysical world, which is untethered from that biophysical world. So what is it about neoliberal economics that's problematic? There are two primary assumptions built into this model. First of all, unlimited economic growth is possible. It's assumed to be enabled by continuous efficiency gains and technological advances. And we've already seen some examples of that. It reinforces humanity's innate propensity to expand. So when you think about the current dilemma on Earth, and we're moving into overshoot here, we're actually being driven by compound positive feedback, the natural propensity to expand exponentially, and the built-in propensity in a constructed model of how the economy works, which expects growth to continue indefinitely. And just to underscore what I'm saying here, here are two quotes from very prominent economists that emphasize what I'm getting at. Lawrence Summers was the former chief economist of the World Bank, subsequently the president of Harvard University, and said many times things like, there are no limits to the carrying capacity of the Earth that are likely to bind at any time in the foreseeable future. Julian Simon, a professor of management studies at the University of Maryland, quote, we have in our hands now the technology to feed, clothe, and supply energy to an ever-growing population for the next 7 billion years. By the way, that's one of the most arithmetically challenged statements that's ever been made, but a lot of people take it seriously. And that's the problem. These are social constructs that are comforting, given our dilemma, and we tend to take them seriously. And if you look at any major economics textbook, you're going to see something called the circular flows model. It's really a model of economic perpetual growth. It shows that the economy consists of really just two things, businesses and households. Businesses sell goods and services to households in exchange for spending on goods and services. But of course, businesses also pay household wages and salaries, and therefore make available to those households some wealth. Households sell back to businesses labor and investment capital, which keeps this whole system going. And the textbooks will describe how these circular counterflows reinforce each other and get bigger with every turn of the screw. And hence it's an economic perpetual motion machine. So the standard model this represents the standard model. There's no environment in the model. The economy has been socially constructed as a self-producing, growing system separate from and independent of anything outside of itself. Okay, keep that in mind. The economy in our minds is essentially independent of anything outside of itself. Two very important concepts come out of cybernetics. It's the study of complex systems and systems control. Stafford Beer once said in a wonderful paper called I Said You Are Gods, we cannot regulate our interaction with any aspect of reality that our model of reality does not include. So keep in mind the nature of our economic models, which exclude any dimension of the biophysical world. A very important cybernetic law is Ashby's law of requisite variety. When the variety or complexity of the environment exceeds the variety or complexity of a regulatory system, the environment will dominate and ultimately destroy the system. In other words, you cannot control a system if you have a controlling mechanism that is simpler than the system itself. We're trying to fly planet Earth with the intellectual equivalent of a 1955 Volkswagen Beetle driver's manual. The manual simply doesn't map to the complexity of the real world. So Ashby's law, if we compare the economy to it, it's clear that the economic construct fails the test. Neoliberal economics is simplistically reductionist. It lacks essential variety. And by the way, so does every other known economic law. But this is the one that happens to be dominant in the world today. The basic economic models contain no useful information about the structural or functional dynamics of the ecological or social systems with which the economy interacts in the real world. Neoliberal economics is utterly incompetent to guide modern techno-industrial societies' interactions with social reality. So here's the simplest, I suppose, modification of the basic model that we could show what's missing. But those goods and services which business create and sell to household are manufactured using available energy and materials extracted from a much larger system called the ecosphere. And 100% of the energy and material that enters the economy returns to that larger system as waste. All of the energy is dissipated in the first order. Energy does not recycle. It goes through in a unidirectional, irreversible manner. And even final products, the material goods, eventually return to the ecosphere as pollution and waste. So this connection is simply ignored in the basic model. What we ought to be looking at is something like this. The economy is just one of many economic systems. Every species has one, but it's a growing economic subsystem within a non-growing finite ecosphere. And yet it is essentially parasitic on that finite ecosphere because it's extracting energy and material on the one hand and dumping its wastes back on the other. Only a small portion of what the industrial economy creates can be materially recycled. And right now we have an imbalance between the amount of solar energy entering the system and the heat loss dissipated out of it because of the accumulation of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. So not only are we parasitic on the non-growing finite ecosphere, but we're heating the whole system up. And this is basically the cause of anthropogenic climate change. Moreover, if you read the economics literature, they explain away the problem of climate change and emissions by saying, well, we can decouple from nature. Any remaining connection to the external world can be decoupled. The economy is essentially dematerializing. Now, I can't get into why this is just another construct, which is mythic, but the biophysical reality is completely different. The human species, if we look at energy and material flows, is the major and the single most significant consumer species in every accessible ecosystem on the planet. The human ecological footprint, and I'll explain what that means in a moment, is continuing to expand with every improved exploitive technology and with every human increase. So again, I want to contrast the prevailing myth, the economist's myth, that any remaining connection to nature can be dismissed because we're decoupling by getting more efficient and inventing substitutes for nature. We're dematerializing. The biophysical reality is completely the opposite. If you look at different measures, we show that we are, in fact, the single most important consumer species on Earth. We make Tyrannosaurus Rex look like a rank amateur. And this is the result, then, of the combined mythic construct and human biological propensities. This is just 10,000 years of human population growth. And you can see that we could actually extend that curve 250,000 or more years to the left. And for 99.9% of that period of time, growth was virtually unmeasurable. But since 1800, we've seen an explosion in the human enterprise, both our population and in the scale of the economy. In just those 200 years, fossil fuel use has increased by a factor of 1,400. We're using 1,400 times more fossil fuel today than we did just 200 years ago. The human population, as a result, has increased eightfold. Gross world product is up by about 103-fold, but again, Earth hasn't gotten any longer. So 250,000 years of negative feedback and just 200 years of explosive growth, during which time positive feedback is dominated. This is the exponential growth of populations and the continuing exponential growth of the human economy. Now, the problem is this past 200 years represents, what, 8 or 10 generations of human beings. So everyone alive today and everyone watching this presentation has lived through the latter part of this period, and we take this to be the norm. Economists expect 2 or 3% of economic growth every year, and if it gets below that, they get worried, and we're into a recession. But the point clear from this graph is that continuous population and economic growth is an anomaly. The exponential growth spurt of the 10 recent generations take to be the norm is actually the single most abnormal period in human history. And I'm going to make the case that what goes up will come down. And to tie this again to fossil energy use, since we're going to be talking about climate and energy, note that the exponential increase in human population corresponds to the exponential increase in the use of fossil fuels. I've marked 2 points here that are significant. 1992, a mere 31 years ago, represents the point at which half fossil fuels were used. In other words, we've used 1/2 of all the fossil fuels ever used by human beings in just the past 30 years or so. And that's the power, again, of exponential growth. I happen to have been born in 1943. And if you do the integral calculus here, you can show that 90% of the fossil fuels ever burned have been burned since 1943. So this is an amazingly recent phenomenon, but one that, since we've all lived in it, we take to be for granted. Meanwhile, it's clear that fossil fuel is the basis of our entire civilization. Gross world product has increased in lockstep with global energy consumption. So this simply shows the growth in GDP over the past 60 years or so against the growth of, the growth of energy use, and they're lockstep. If we plot different countries in terms of their gross national products versus fossil fuel use, in this case, oil consumption, again, you get a curve that is almost a perfect correlation. So what these curves show and underscore is the utter dependence of our way of life, our way of being on fossil fuels. Of course, there are consequences. What this curve shows is the continuous uptick in carbon dioxide emissions, or concentrations rather, in the atmosphere. The sawtooth pattern is rendered because during the northern hemisphere winters, when plants shut down and photosynthesis is not assimilating carbon dioxide, the curve ticks upward. And in the summer, when northern hemisphere, which contains most of the world's vegetation, becomes alive and growing, and photosynthesis is at its maximum, the actual concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere fall. But every year, the uptick during the winter months, with the combustion of fossil fuels and the increase in home heating and so on and so forth, the uptick is just a little bit longer than the downtick, and so the upward direction of the overall curve is apparent here. Now, this curve also shows a number of very significant events. First of all, the document Limits to Growth, which you can now download from online, was published way back in 1970. And so this is over 1972, 50 odd years ago. Limits to Growth suggested that were this curve to continue, by the middle of this century, the current century, there would be a significant impact on the atmosphere. Climate change would take off, and there would be a very high likelihood of population decline as well. In 1992, that's 20 years after Limits to Growth, this world scientists issued their first warning to humanity. And again, you can download this from the internet. Also, I've plotted here, at least I took this from a graph that had plotted all of these significant events on climate. There's been 27 COP meetings, including the last one in Sharm el-Sheikh in 2022. There's one coming up in a couple of weeks, and that'll be number 28. But the point is that we've seen 27 COP meetings, the Limits to Growth publication, world scientists' warnings to humanity, and various other agreements, all of which are directed toward warning people about the dangers of this escalating increase in atmospheric carbon emissions, and it's had no effect whatsoever. Perhaps that's an exaggeration. Things might have been worse in the absence of these things. But the point is that all of these climate meetings are designed or oriented toward reducing the atmospheric carbon levels, and in fact, they failed miserably to do so. So the path to atmospheric carbon reductions has been paved increasing fossil fuel use and is strewn with failed climate agreements. Countries sign these agreements, they make commitments, and then simply fail to abide by them. Last week, James Hansen, the most prominent, I suppose, of US climate scientists, and his team, I guess there were 15 people listed as authors of this paper, argued that global warming in the pipeline, that's to say that we can't avoid, and emissions in the pipeline that we can't avoid, assure that the goal of the Paris Agreement to keep global warming well below 2 Celsius degrees is already dead, particularly if policy is constrained only to emissions reductions plus uncertain and unproved carbon dioxide removal methods. These have proved totally ineffective. So this is the track we are on, already in the pipeline and committed to these kinds of increases. Well, so something much bigger is afoot here. And I want to explain just very briefly what we mean by the ecological footprint. This is a method I developed with my graduate students in the 70s and 80s, and we're still working on it. In fact, just published a major review paper last month. It's a way of estimating the total human demand on Earth. We define the ecological footprint of any specified population as the total productive area of land and water ecosystems required on a continuous basis to produce the bioresources that that population consumes and to assimilate its mostly carbon wastes, no matter where the relevant land or water is on Earth. So that we have to understand here that every population, since we're all consumers, has an ecological footprint, whether you're conscious of it or not. Moreover, I think it's important to underscore that this is a finite planet. The biocapacity of the Earth is shrinking because of the overshoot problem, and eco-footprints are exclusive areas. If you are using a certain area to grow your food and fiber, nobody else can use that area. So all human beings are competing for Earth's limited biocapacity. Every addition to the human population means that the competition intensifies because the total amount of biocapacity, productive land and water ecosystems, is shrinking even as the demand on those areas is increasing. So we've estimated the per capita eco footprints of different countries and nations, population income groups and all of that sort of thing, so that we can say that the average per capita ecological footprint in high income countries ranges between 4 and 10 global average hectares, which is 10 to 25 acres. Poorest people on Earth live on as little as a half to a third of a hectare, or about 3/4 of an acre. But there are only 1.5 global average hectares per person on the planet. So compare what high income people require with their fair allocation. And what we show is that Americans and Canadians use 5 times our equitable share of global biocapacity, which is one of the reasons why the poorest people on Earth have to get by on a very small proportion of their fair share of global capacity. If we look at this in global context, note again that world gross world product has increased by 100-fold since 1800. The human footprint in 2022, this is the last year for which we have data, was about 20.6 billion hectares. But the capacity of the planet, measured in terms of the amount of viable land and waterscape, productive ecosystems, is only 12 billion hectares. Pardon me. So we're living on Earth as if it were about 72% larger than it actually is. Okay, so this is a crude measure of overshoot in terms of the difference between the amount of productive land and waterscape and assimilative capacity of that land and waterscape. And this means that economic today is being financed in part not on the annual production of ecosystems, but by liquidating the standing stock. So we're not just harvesting what forests grow every year, we're cutting down the standing stock. We're not just harvesting the recruitment to fish stocks every year, we're depleting our fish stocks, we're destroying our soils, and virtually every other major asset that we have on Earth that is part of the biophysical heritage is being depleted in order to make up the gap between the actual human demand and the available permanent, or rather, biocapacity. But there's all sorts of socially constructed good news. If we just look, there's many problems here, but since we're concerned about climate change, I'm just going to look at one aspect of this socially constructed good news. In the US, Mark Jacobson is famous for his promotion of the idea that 100% renewable energy, it can be fast. The goal is 80% by 2030, 100% by 2050. And ideally, if we can get to 80% by 2030, we should get to 100% by 2035 to 2040. So this is an amazingly optimistic perspective. And I give you the source of this if you're interested in pursuing it, just to show you that I'm not distorting reality here, at least his version of reality. Here's another quote. Electricity from solar, wind, and water should power the entire world in less than 10 years, leading energy experts say. Renewable energy could also be the sole energy source for the world's heating, cooling, transport, and so on industries by 2035. We're talking about barely a decade away. And again, you could check out this sort. By the way, all of these slides are available for anyone who wants them. Another quote. By 2050, we could get all the energy we need from renewable sources. This report, the one I'm quoting, shows that such a transition is not only possible, but cost-effective, providing energy that is affordable for all and producing it in ways that can be sustained by the global economy and the planet. So these are, I think, fairly typical of the ebullient optimism that many proponents of renewable green energy profess. And I'm sorry to say that they're largely mythic social constructs at this point. I've changed the caption that was on this cartoon, but it's a wonderful illustration. Basically, what renewable green energy, even if it has succeeded, is simply business as usual by alternative means. It's equivalent to electrifying the Titanic without paying any attention to the fact that there are icebergs in the path. The only thing that the mainstream seems able to produce is a shipwreck. We agree to replace the coal-powered engines with electric motors, is the analogy I'm trying to draw here. And the bottom line is that quantitative replacement of fossil fuels with renewable green energy would perpetuate overshoot and the continued degradation of the ecosphere. So again, climate change is a huge problem. I'm not for a moment suggesting it is not, but we're not solving climate change, and everything we do to attempt to do so actually exacerbates climate change itself, because almost all of the technologies we're considering are fossil fuel dependent, and even if they succeeded, it would simply exacerbate overshoot. So I owe you a reality check, and anybody can look up numbers like this. You can download the Statistical Review of World Energy 2023, so this is right up to date. And by looking at these data, the charts and graphs and interpretations in the document, we find the following. In 2022, the last year for which the full data are available, fossil fuels provided 81.8% of global primary energy. That's the energy used up front in coal-fired plants and fossil fuel generated other uses of fossil fuels. Wind and solar gave us the fossil energy equivalent of 6%. Wind and solar produce electricity. So when I say fossil energy equivalent, I'm saying how much fossil fuel would you have to use to get the similar amount of electricity? And it amounts to about 6% of what's being used globally at the present time. This means that last year, fossil fuel powered the world, and these are very optimistic statistics, for 297 days out of 365. Wind and solar, where everybody's piling in their money and investment, gave us 22 days at best. And actually, that's a gross exaggeration for reasons we'll see in a moment. If we look at electricity, which is where wind and solar actually shine, fossil fuels still generated 60.6% of the world's electrical energy in 2022. Wind and solar produced 11.7%. Meanwhile, the growth in total demand for electricity increased by 644.9 terawatt hours. Growth in the contribution from wind and solar was amazing at 439 terawatt hours, but that's still very significantly less than the total growth in the demand for electricity. So even though wind and solar are admittedly growing rapidly, despite this spectacular growth, they're not even keeping up with demand. And this means that, I should emphasize that since electricity, if we look at the middle line again, fossil fuels generated 60.6% of electrical energy, wind and solar produced 11.7%. Since electricity is only 19% of final energy consumption, that's the energy actually used by consumers, this means that at less than 12% of final supply, wind and solar gave consumers, you and I, only 2.3% of their total energy last year. Let me underscore that. We are being told over and over again that 100% renewable energy is possible in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. The reality is that right now, wind and solar is only 2.3% of total global energy at the consumer level. And the growth in demand for energy is increasing vastly more rapidly than the growth in demand of supply of wind and solar electricity. Just to underscore this reality, take a look at this curve again from 2022. Fossil energy powered the world for almost 300 days. Wind and solar gave us at most 22. And you can see that the vast majority of our energy still is fossil fuel, oil, coal, and natural gas. You can barely see wind and solar and other renewables at the top of the chart. So this means, and I have to underscore this because we hear over and over again, stop fossil fuels. If we were to end fossil fuel energy use abruptly, large cities would be abandoned, hundreds of millions of people would likely perish from food and other resource shortages, there would be civil strife and geopolitical chaos. We are so dependent on fossil fuels, and wind and solar are providing so little at the margin. In fact, all modern renewables up here are providing so little of our total energy requirements that to abandon fossil fuels in the next 5, 10, or 15 years without adequate substitutions would result in a geopolitical chaos and the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. Just again, to illustrate this from a slightly different source, this is world average per capita energy consumption from 1800 to 2022. And what you can see here is per capita energy consumption is a massive increase in coal, oil, and natural gas use since the early 1800s. Wind and solar are this little trivial edge up here. So that, again, I have to underscore that wind and solar combined provided the fossil fuel equivalent of only 6.1% of global primary energy and less than 2.5% of the world's final energy use. And this is on a per capita basis. So there's a bigger problem here, and that is that people tend to believe our myths. And for the last several decades, ordinary citizens have been socially engineered through the construct of myths to ignore the reality that we've just looked at. Politics is increasingly influenced by neoliberal ideology, religious fundamentalism, climate change denial, anti-intellectualism, and other forms of magical thinking. In 2016, the Oxford Dictionary's Word of the Year, every year they nominate a word to be the word of the year, it was post-truth, which they defined as relating to or denoting circumstances in which objective facts are less influential in shaping public opinion than are appeals to emotion and personal beliefs, that is to say, social construct. So sometimes editorial cartoonists say it best, and I think this is a brilliant cartoon. Human beings as storytellers, as believers in social constructs, are much more attracted to reassuring lies than they are to the inconvenient truths shown in actual data. To make matters worse, with the spread of social media and various rejections of science, it's come to the point where people tend to believe the postmodernist dream that reality is whatever I say it is. So we're entering into a new age of unreason. Many contemporary social constructs are based on science denial and magical thinking. Another great cartoon that gets this idea across. I added this caption: "Welcome to the 21st century endarkenment." And there's much evidence that that's exactly what we're going into, a period of rejection of reality, because the competing socially constructed mythology is just that much more attractive. So delusional thinking is actually the human way. We cannot not act out of our social constructs. The question is, how accurate are your social constructs? So we tend to create simple but wrong social constructs because of our Paleolithic brains. So what we get are techno fixes, such as so-called green energy transition, business as usual by alternative means, which will worsen the climate and extend overshoot, leading to potential collapse. Now, again, I'm not making this up. That graph of the increasing carbon dioxide emissions was a graph that took place during the period in which we are purportedly getting more and more efficient. There has been never a period in human history in which economic and material efficiency has increased faster, and yet things are worsening. Climate has worsened, and we've extended overshoot dramatically in the last 50 years. What we really need is a plan B, which is to say a way of life which generates smaller ecological footprints. We need absolute reductions in energy and material consumption. This is the only way to reduce not only climate change, but biodiversity losses and all of the other things I listed earlier. And we need population planning on a global level to lead to more equitable sustainability. Finally, I think we have to recognize that human beings as an evolved species are subject to the same population dynamics as any other species. This is a graph taken from a standard biological textbook in most universities in North America. And what it shows is the so-called boom-bust tendencies of certain kinds of species. All species, as I said earlier, are capable of exponential expansion. However, for the most part, they're held in check by negative feedback. When conditions turn favorable, so the predators all die off, or there's a particularly abundant food supply, those populations will be released to expand exponentially, and they do so. So positive feedback prevails during the boom phase. But the boom leads to the depletion of nutrients, or overcrowding, or the spread of disease, so that negative feedback sets in and the population busts. So we see in many species continuous cycles through the boom and bust phases of population growth. Here is a classic real-world example. A reindeer introduced to a couple of the Pribilof Islands off of Alaska during the war. And we see an explosion of population because very favorable conditions. No predators on these islands and massive supplies of lichens, which is the food for a reindeer. So the normal response of these populations with exponential growth. Plenty results in explosion. However, the population overshoots the resource supplies and then crashes from depletion. In this case, the overgrazing of lichens. Now, I want you to remember the human population curve in relation to our, I suppose, analogy with lichens rather would be abundant, cheap energy. The abundant, cheap energy is the means by which human beings have acquired all other resources needed to release us from our negative feedback and grow exponentially. So here again is that replication of the human, this is the actual human growth curve. And basically, it's a fossil fuel-induced explosion of the human enterprise. So you can compare fossil fuels with lichens in the sense that fossil fuels gave us access to everything else. Note the shape of that curve compared to the shape of the curve here for the reindeer, at least the boom phase of the curve. So this could well be, this next curve shows what I think is the potential fate of human beings. We are nearing the peak of a one-off boom-bust population cycle. So we've seen a period of rapid geometric or exponential growth. It's taken us far beyond the long-term carrying capacity of the Earth, the population that the Earth could sustain at the average material standard. Once we've exceeded carrying capacity, we're into overshoot. But overshoot means that we're depleting the assets that have sustained us, just as the reindeer depleted their lichens, humans are depleting soils, fish stocks, forests, oil, and so forth. We're nearing the peak and are likely to crash. Now, the question is, will we crash like this, or can we manage to follow this dotted red line here? We can't achieve the green line, which is one planet living. We're human beings, really an intelligent species. Instead of exploding into overshoot, we would have gradually controlled our population so that we would live within the carrying capacity of Earth in a state of one planet living as if we had just one planet instead of 1.75 planets as we seem to be living now. But once we're in overshoot and depleting our assets, the carrying capacity declines. So that if the population does peak and then become down, it won't achieve the green standard. The best we can do is come along here, and that's anybody's guess. I think it's probably on the order of 1 to 2 billion people. So here's our paradigmatic trap. Because we socially construct our realities, that which is ecologically and socially necessary is politically infeasible. But what is politically feasible is ecologically and socially ineffective, if not catastrophic. And again, I think the curves I showed you of our attempts to control carbon emissions is a perfect illustration of this. Everything we've attempted to do politically has messed up completely. It's ineffective and potentially catastrophic because we're still on that curve. And my final slide, again, is a nod, tip of the hat to editorial cartoonists who really seem to be able to put everything I've said in a nutshell. Assuming present trends continue, the odds are quite good that we will become the best informed extinct species on the planet. I don't think we'll go extinct, but certainly I think the days of fossil fuel powered or any other energy intensive civilization are numbered, and we have a choice between planning a reasonable descent or enduring a catastrophic, a chaotic decline as the Earth simply fights back and declines to continue sustaining us. So that's it. And I thank you for your patience. I hope you got something out of this. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bill. Hopefully you have time for a few questions.
I have time.
All right. I will jump in and start because since I'm hosting. My question is, I feel like as an individual or even as a community, we have almost no control over what the global system does, right? But as a community, as a San Juan County or whatever community people are from that are joining tonight, what can we do in our community to help prepare people and try to get people to understand the reality that you've laid out here today?
Well, it's a huge question. You're really asking for the redesign of civilization. For one thing, you can talk about it. I mean, I've tried to present in a nutshell what I don't even know how long it took, 40 minutes or something, a huge, huge problem and condensing a massive amount of information here. And as I said at the outset, most people are not well equipped to understand, let alone to respond to these kinds of data. But that's the starting point. We really need to be a much better informed, much better educated population if we're going to move forward. So let's first of all get real. And I mean this because our social constructs are not reality. We have to reconstruct the way we see the world so that we're not perceiving it through rose-colored glasses that distort the nature of the reality in which we find ourselves. The second thing I would recommend is political engagement. Go to meetings of all candidates for local and all the way up to federal elections and ask the embarrassing questions. Why aren't they talking about the real issues instead of taking us down rabbit holes of self-delusion? I think that's extremely important. Even if you get thrown out of a meeting for being a pain in the ass, it's an important thing to do because people will pay attention to what you've got to say. You might even find, as I have done, you've got a lot of silent listeners in the audience who congratulate you on what you said, even though they were afraid to say it themselves. The third thing I would do if I were in a position to do so was to help organize my community for the kind of a future that's likely to unfold. So if there is to be a future on the planet, it's likely to be a more localized future where we are more locally self-sufficient for food and other key resources, where we have to husband our soils and landscape. I mean, I live in a region that's growing rapidly because of that. And you said it before, we're not really in control of the global forces, but we have a national population policy in Canada that wants to get us to 100 million people from our current 40 million people by the end of the century. And that means we're admitting 500,000 immigrants every year. It's putting a huge demand on our agricultural land for housing and so on. And we're paving it over. And the rationale is, oh, we can always get it from somewhere else, like California, which is drying up and suffering from groundwater depletion and so on and so forth. We have to ask, how much longer is it going to be a reasonable thing to say you can always import your foodstuffs from somewhere else? That's an absurd assessment or thing to believe in the period that we are today. So that's it. Get serious. Try to help your neighbors and your family and your friends to have a realistic interpretation of the nature of the reality in which we find ourselves. Become politically engaged at the local to national levels to the extent that you can. Ask the embarrassing question and then participate locally in trying to develop institutions and frameworks and ways of thinking that prepare us for the inevitable changes that are going to be coming over the next couple of decades.
I will open it up to other people. I have many more questions, but if I want to let other people ask questions. Anybody want to jump in? Please do.
Hi there. If you can hear me, I'd love to ask a question.
We can hear you.
Great. Thank you so much for pulling this together. And then thank you very much for this presentation. Let me adjust the. My question for you is, my understanding is that if you look at the history of neoliberalism, many of those ideas and the people who framed them did so in an environment where they understood that their ideas were not necessarily a good match for the time. So if you look at the New Deal era, et cetera, but they bided their time. They waited until, as I've read, the late 1960s and 1970s, and then especially the 1980s, bided their time. And once that window opened up for their ideas to be received, where they were a good fit with the times, jumped through that window and took advantage of it. My question to you is, in addition to the local focus, which to me is, I think, the thing that resonates most, when you expand beyond that to the national or international level, have you come across any thinkers that you believe might have some ideas that are laying around there, so that if and when the time does come that those ideas are a good fit for the context, they might be good tools to pick up and run with? If that, hopefully that question is clear enough.
Yeah, there's a lot of excellent material out there, should we choose to pick it up. If I were to recommend one thing, it's a book called Steady State Economics by the late, great Herman Daly, who was one of the founding fathers, I suppose you could say, of the discipline of ecological economics. So a steady state is a situation in which there's a constant throughput, that is to say, a constant input of energy and material and a constant ejection of waste that is compatible with the assimilative capacities of the ecosystem in which you happen to operate. Your body is a steady state, right? You maintain a steady temperature. You consume, if your weight is constant, a certain amount of calories every day. You radiate the equivalent amount of heat. So there's nothing unusual about a steady state. The point, though, is that we have an economy which is anything but a steady state. It's one which is utterly dependent on constant increases in energy and material consumption and the dissipation of that, all of it, all of the energy and material back into the ecosphere once it's used, and it's used up in a degraded form. So it's a recipe for absolute disaster. You're taking valuable, useful energy and material and converting it in the very short term into useful products, but all of that returns as degraded waste to the system, thereby further undermining the future productive capacity of that system. So what we need to do is to develop a level of economic activity which uses the annual output of the Earth's ecosystems and dumps wastes back into the ecosystems that is compatible with the assimilative capacity of those systems. And if we have that balance, we're in a steady state, just as your body is in a steady state with its intake and output. So Herman Daly, Steady State Economics, there's thousands of references in that book and his subsequent works. You can go online and look up Herman Daly, D-A-L-Y, and it'll take you all sorts of interesting places.
Thank you very much.
Be my
Andy and Scott Finley, you have a question.
Yeah, thank you, Bill. That was very, very interesting. Are you familiar with Kate Rayworth and Donut Economics? Can you speak about
very
that?
much so. Yeah, I've had conversations with Kate, yes. Yeah. So Donut Economics, look, there's many things in play here. Some scientists have created the concept of ecological limits. We're beyond certain limits to the capacity of the planet. But scientists tend to ignore the social context. So Kate has developed a notion that we also have a floor of minimal quality of life that people have to understand. So the steady state economy that I was referring to earlier would have to be balanced between accommodating to the productive and assimilative capacities of the ecosphere, but also establishing a population level which would give an adequate material and social standard of life for the people that live there. So you'd be creating a minimal floor of equality and equity and so on, and a maximum scale to the size of the enterprise so that you don't shoot beyond the carrying capacity limits of the key variables of the ecosphere. Any other questions?
Yes, we have one from Jeremy Jimenez. Hi, Jeremy.
Hi, Bill. Thanks. This is a little tangential to your topic, but as an ecology question, I'm curious, what do you think about when we manage planning for invasive species? So we currently think of certain species as, oh, this is not native, so we should control it or maybe eradicate it. But as the planet warms and ecosystems change, and we see those changes unfolding, like, what's your stance on actually allowing plants in that we anticipate might be better suited to environment? And would you even go so far that if you make a projection of likely warming of 2 to 3 Celsius degrees, does it make sense to even plan now for plants that might be better suited to that? Or is that just too much hubris that we can make those kind of controlling decisions?
Oh, again, huge questions. If you think of invasive species, the biggest invasive species on the planet is sitting around this table. And
Sure.
okay, so listen, animals and plants move around Earth by any means possible. So yes, sometimes a species that invades and disrupts what we're used to is a nuisance. And there are many circumstances where the economic and social damage means that it's worth attempting to control that. But the fact is, there will be, and it's accelerating, more and more invasion of habitats by species that haven't been there before for precisely the reasons you mentioned. Climate change is a perfectly good one. But if you really are serious about a 2 to 3 degree warming, look at what's happened with about a degree of warming right now in Celsius terms. We've seen an incredible change in the climate patterns around Earth. With 2 to 3 degrees warming, it's entirely possible that we'll pass some tipping point, in which case we enter into a runaway greenhouse Earth conditions. Some argue right now that as many as 2 billion people will be displaced from their home territories by climate change that is currently underway, 2 degrees of warming. So what kind of planet will we have if there are 2 billion climate refugees? And they're not just climate refugees. This means what we're really talking about here is vast swaths of Earth becoming uninhabitable. And it doesn't mean it has to be uninhabitable all year. All you need is a few days in a year in which a place is uninhabitable to make it essentially uninhabitable. So we're going to see massive changes in the capability of very large areas on Earth, including the southern United States, to support human life, much of Australia, India, and so on. So it's not just other species we have to be concerned about. It's our own species here if we hit 2 to 3 degrees. But your basic point is well taken. There will be massive changes in the distribution and abundance of plants and animals almost everywhere. It's already occurring. People in the forestry sector can tell you that some of our forest trees here locally are suffering from climate change of one kind or another, will be displaced as time moves on. So yeah, good question.
Thanks, Bill.
We have a question from Neil Jones in chat, so I'll read it. Planned degrowth is the only solution, but given the Homo sapien brain, this could be problematic, as you point out, and a precipitating global crisis may be the only way out of this. Can you see such an outcome arising from the current global context, military, geopolitical, economic, pandemic, climate change, etc.?
Oh dear, oh dear. Okay, I think you're right. I've written many, many times about planned degrowth and what we would have to do to implement a program of planned degrowth. So this is the nice way for us to, as it were, contract the human enterprise to make it compatible with Earth. But even the official, there is something called the degrowth movement. It's largely active in Europe, much more so than in North America. But even they avoid grasping the population needle. So to them, degrowth means, yes, a much smaller economy. We need to reduce the scale of economic throughput to be compatible with the universe. But it means that we have to share what's available among the 8 billion people on Earth. So the question then becomes, by what mechanism are you going to convince the relatively wealthy to share with the relatively impoverished? And there are many ideas. One of them is called contraction and convergence, for example, that we in the rich countries must reduce massively our energy and material use to create the ecological space to enable poor countries to rise to a relatively tolerable standard of living. So we contract while they grow, and we converge at some level. But if you look at the current population and the anticipated additional 2 billion people, and you compare the amount of biocapacity on the planet to the demand, you'll see that the average material standard that Earth could support at, say, 8 or 10 billion people is a fraction of what we enjoy today. Certainly well below 80%. We would have to reduce our energy and material consumption in North America voluntarily by over 80% to contract to a relatively equitable position. I don't think any of the presidential candidates in the upcoming US federal election is going to campaign on the basis of asking people to reduce their consumption by up to 80%. Of course, we already have gross inequity on Earth, including within the United States. I mean, the wealthy are with the richest 50% now of Americans controlling 89% or something of all the wealth in the country. So the first thing we would need to do is to address the gross inequity that exists even within nations at current material standards, and then think of drawing the whole thing down. So I do not think, personally, that it's in us to engage in a cooperative global initiative to contract the global economy in a manner that you might call to generate a soft landing. So if I were a betting man, I think it's highly probable that it'll be a rough ride. and that we're already seeing, you know, the evidence of resource conflict. The Mideast war between the Palestinians, or if you like, Hamas, and the Israelis is a population problem. There's too many people and not enough land. Were there sufficient acreage, both of those groups could have their own nation. And by the way, I have to point out that they're the same people. You know, genetically, they're all Semites. And what they're fighting over is different social constructs of reality. Judaism on the one hand, and Islam on the other. Both of these are human products of the human mind, and yet we take them so seriously that we're willing to go to war and to kill over them, rather than to recognize, hey, we're basically the same peoples. We all have origins in this place. How can we come together cooperatively to share the land and resource base in ways that enable us all to survive? Well, that doesn't seem to be the human way. And again, I would argue that it's because we are basically Cro-Magnon, or even further back, Paleolithic humans, when tribal conflicts didn't amount to particularly destructive things. But today, of course, with weapons of mass destruction, these old tribal patterns are utterly destructive and may well lead to a massive conflagration on Earth if we went to nuclear war, for example. We're not well suited. I think it goes right back to my first comments that we are no longer well adapted to the complexities of our own society and technologies, let alone the world as it was before we became the dominant species.
Yeah, thank you for that. Anybody else got any other questions? I don't see any hands up, so let's leave it there. Thank you all so much for participating. I really appreciate it. Thank you so much, Bill, for presenting tonight. It's wonderful. Thank you. And to everybody who's here, please join us again 2 weeks from now on November 28th, when we'll hear from Jeremy Jimenez, who was here tonight. Thank you, Jeremy. And he's going to talk about why climate change is, or why climate is the wrong focus. And then again, 2 weeks after that, on December 12th, we'll hear from Max Wilbert about organizing to halt ecological overshoot. So I hope to see you in 2 weeks. And thank you so much, everybody, for being here. And I'm going to make the recording available, so I'll send that out. So if you want to rewatch or send it to anybody else, you can do that.
Thank you very much, all of you, for being here. I'll leave now.
Night, everybody.